Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. Well, the big idea we're discussing this week is what's happening between the United States and India with Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. Joining me for that is John Lipinski. He's Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also a director at NBC News, Director of Elections. I'm also joined by Anirudh Suri of the India Internet Fund, also a scholar at Carnegie India. Thank you both very much for being on the Dialogues.
Thank you for having us.
Professor Lipinski, it's an interesting time in India-US ties, of course, with Prime Minister Modi and President Trump's meeting as well. Where do you see the road ahead? I know it's hard to predict under this new Trump administration, but Foreign Minister Jaishankar said recently that President Trump is, in a sense, out of syllabus for India. How do you think this relationship is going to play out?
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of people might say he's out of syllabus like right now. And I think that, again, the caveat not knowing for sure, because Trump is very hard to sort of predict his behavior. But I mean, I think right now, like he's carrying through on some of his campaign promises. So some of them might be a little more extreme than people thought, but he ran on an America's first sort of campaign. And so I think that the thing is that a lot of Americans didn't fully understand what that meant. So I think that like right now what we're seeing is him focusing on economic issues, particularly trade, and on immigration issues. And I think both of those are going to be very consequential for India.
How much do you think personal chemistry matters? Because of course, in India, we've had Prime Minister Modi and President Trump we had Howdy Modi campaigns, we had Namaste Trump. We've had a relationship between the Republicans and the Modi government, which has seemed pretty close. We've already seen some concessions on, like, say, Harley-Davidson, on import duties. And India's very keen to avoid a trade war. How do you see that playing out? Is the main focus going to be economic? Or do you think it's also going to be looking at the China factor? Why do you think the US and India work in a sense?
Well, I mean, I think that there is a perception, at least in the States, that India is a country that Trump is somewhat favorable to. But I would say on that, there are other countries also that sort of fit into that bucket. And even with some, when we look at our allies, India is obviously one of them. Some of Trump's behavior has been, sort of, again, out of portfolio, as you might say, where when we're looking at a place like Canada, where we've had an extremely long, successful sort of, I would even say partnership in some ways. It's a very strong relationship. There's been, pretty significant threats, like, when we're looking primarily at tariff, but also on immigration fronts. And so what I would say here is that right now, Trump wants concessions, and he wants concessions from friends. So I think, if he comes out with what he considers to be wins, they might even be small wins, as long as he can sort of portray them as wins. I think that could bode well for sort of US-India relations, but he's going to want something. And I think right now the question is what exactly sort of will that be? But I do think he has some admiration for Prime Minister Modi.
How do you see it, Anirudh? Because, of course, you've seen Trump, Biden, and then Trump again. In a sense, Trump 2.0 is very different from the first presidency.
I think he's more assertive now. I think one can expect him to be more assertive. He's gotten a little bit of the lay of the land. He's also seen a state, while he was out of power, acting against him. So I think he wants to take much stronger control of the US administration and its various arms. Of course, he has the benefit of having the Congress also with him now. So I think he'll be much more sure of his efforts. I think the other piece to keep in mind this time around is he has a very different set of advisors this time around. He has, as we saw at the inauguration, a bunch of tech leaders.
Tech bros.
I think advising him. It remains to be seen which of those he will listen to and which he won't. But you'll see a very different set of advisors this time. And I think while there are some China hawks, there are some very strongly pro-India advisors also. But I think at the same time, this administration will have a lot of advisors that are not DC based. And hence I think economic interest arising out of, let's say, Silicon Valley and other corporations in the US will play a very different role in determining, let's say, policy towards India versus what we had seen in the Biden administration, where the DC policy crew was driving the India relationship. So I think this time it will be a lot more commercially driven from the US side as well.
Because interestingly, and that's a strategic point of view also, we know that President Trump is very keen that India buy more military equipment from the United States, and that's going to be a big aspect looking at China as well. How important do you think the geopolitics is going to be in the Trump-India relationship?
I think that it's going to be, I think it will be sort of consequential. When you actually look at sort of I know right now that there is no bipartisanship, or at least seems to be no bipartisanship in Washington. But remember, President Trump is elected for 4 years, and and the House is extremely close right now. The Republicans they lost seats this last election, so it's even tighter than it was the last election. So I do think that when we look at sort of across the board, there's been a lot of concern about China, not so much concern about India. And so I think the geopolitical angle will be important. If India ends up buying more military equipment from the United States, trade imbalances is something that Trump wants to bring home as a win. And so we could easily see ways, I think, where these two countries could kind of work together in ways that I think Trump would view as advantageous. And I don't know exactly how India, especially the India people, will actually think about that. But again, I think that this is something that he needs to bring home to his sort of electorate, because he needs to bring home, he ran on the economy. And if the economy does not do well, I think it's going to be super consequential. And even though he's threatening tariffs, and he says that tariffs are a beautiful word, a lot of people, including many of his advisors, know that not to be true.
Mm-hmm. So just taking that point, because what's also, I think, struck many watching from here, from New Delhi, has been, because immigration was such a big election promise for President Trump, but the deportation, the planes that came back, the kind of tweets that are going out, what we see Vivek Ramaswamy going through when he talks about, say, merit, does seem to have a racist undertone. What is it like for you, as somebody who's working very closely with Washington, D.C. and India in venture funds? How has the atmosphere, the environment actually changed? Is it as welcoming to Indians, and what about for Indian Americans?
Yeah, I think there are usually 2 or 3 different segments of Indian Americans, right, that you'll have to look at. Yes. The Indian Americans that are operating in the startup, tech, venture capital world tend to be less affected by these things. I think even the H-1B debate that's been raging, my sense is that it'll eventually end up in favor of skilled Indian immigrants, being still welcome in the US. But I think it'll be the middle and the lower middle segments of Indian immigrants as well as Indian Americans that might get affected by some of these racist undertones. I think if you look at the history of various ethnic groups in the US, no one has escaped, I think, the slight undertones of racism at some point or the other. So I don't think we should kid ourselves that somehow Indians as a group or Indian Americans as a group will escape it fully. But I think what will be hopefully the case is that it does not get out of control in some ways, as we've seen in the past against certain other ethnic groups. And I think that's where the economic relationship between India and the US being fair, balanced, and forward-looking, I think will be important. Because I think the racist undertones, my experience has been, take a much higher tone when a certain ethnic group is seen to be taking away the jobs, the economic opportunities. So I think it'll be a very fine balance to be struck.
How do you see that, Professor Lipinski? Because of course, even when President Trump announced his AI advisor, who studied in Chennai, we saw again, and this is often very much online. So this is often kind of like fueled in a sense by the online world and on X. And Elon Musk, of course, will intervene in many debates. On H-1B, he first said, I'm ready to go to war. Then he kind of withdrew. So how do you see that actually playing out? And of course, the deportation, and India has made the point that they've raised this, that them coming back, illegal migrants coming back in handcuffs and chains, was something that disturbed India greatly.
And we've seen that in other countries. And that is something that's a policy actually that occasionally happened in previous administrations, as you might know, but it was only for people that were sort of guilty or accused of crimes or other sorts of things. It's not for somebody that because of not, being undocumented in the United States. So I'm going to take a slightly sort of different sort of perspective on that. And so one of the things that I'm worried that it might be sort of where there could be an issue is with students and student visas. And so one thing is, if you look at, and I'm a professor, I have a dual career, I'm also in the media, but when you look at the composition at my university, at Penn, a large portion of students are international students, and quite a few of them are Indian. And they come on, they get their F1 visa so they can study at Penn, and they also can stay on and get OPT training so they can stay in the United States and work legally, for 1, 2, or 3 years, I believe, depending upon what status they have with that. And so, given that Trump is also scapegoating, he's scapegoating a number of different groups, including higher education, and given that there are so many international students that are part of higher education in the United States, there could be some unintended consequences, at least for universities, and again, it could be very detrimental.
So, in fact, Indian students are actually the highest chunk of international students in the United States. I think they're over 3.3 lakhs, if I'm not mistaken. So, how does that? I mean, again, reports here in Indian newspapers that Indian students are being stopped and asked for papers, etc. So, when you talk about scapegoating, how are universities? What would you tell a parent who may be looking to send their children to the United States? Is it still a good place for an Indian student to go?
Well, I think that one of the things that I think people at university are worried, and so because we welcome and treat everybody equally, at least within university, and I think the worry is not so much what our positions will be. It's just about uncertainty. Even at the beginning this second Trump administration, I remember that some students were being advised, don't go home during the holiday break, because we don't know exactly what could happen. Maybe you'll get held up because of your visa status. And so when you actually think about the well-being of students, especially for international students, you're far away from home as an international student. There's a lot of difficulties associated with that, a lot of excitement and other things at the same time. But one of the things that we want our students to come and thrive. And one of the things that I've noticed with any student is uncertainty does not lead to people thriving. And so I feel that uncertainty is something that just will probably be hanging over the students, but also obviously the parents of these students. And it's a very unfortunate situation.
Anirudh, your take on that as somebody who's works also and has studied there and has gone back and forth.
Yeah, I've been on the F1 visa. I studied at Penn and Harvard, etc. So I think that the uncertainty point is absolutely correct. I think if it's hanging over the students' minds, of course, they can't thrive. That's absolutely correct. I think this ultimately has to be dealt at a government-to-government level. I think that students are a big source of revenue, of course, for universities there. Great skills, of course. A lot of them end up applying for the H-1Bs and then end up starting companies there. And so there's economic value for the US clearly there. And these are, again, top quality students often. I think it's something that I think the government-to-government conversation will be very important because the students don't have much control over these policies. And I'm hoping that the two governments will be very clear that illegal or undocumented migrants being returned or deported back is an absolutely separate issue. But the students who are on legitimate, proper visas should not face such uncertainty about their futures or the ability to come back, go back, whether for family reasons or personal reasons. So I think it should be a big priority for the Indian government as well to make sure that that segment does not get affected.
I wanted to comment on technology because, of course, you deal in that. But that's been identified as one of the key areas of collaboration between India and America now. Earlier also we saw that India and the US had actually taken giant leaps in the sense that we were now dealing in areas of space, defense, often which were not really open earlier between us, and now also looking at the need for chips and semiconductors and strategic, say, sensitive areas. Do you think that's an area which we're going to see expand now? Are we going to continue that, which the ISET initiative, which came up under President Biden, under President Trump? How do you see it going forward?
I think it will continue. I think that the foundation that's been laid for the US-India Tech Cooperation is absolutely strong. I think it will continue in areas like space, because I think now deep roots have been laid over the last few years, including in the previous Trump administration. So even though ISET as an initiative is new, I think the tech cooperation between the two countries now has, I think, been around for a couple of decades. My earlier stint in Carnegie in Washington over 20 years ago was when the nuclear deal was being struck. And I think now nuclear is also
so we've come a long way from there, really, yes.
So I think the foundation is very strong. But I think one key thing for India to keep in mind this time around is that tech policy under the Trump administration will be less driven, I think, from DC. and more from Silicon Valley. And therefore, the kinds of, I think, negotiation, the kinds of commercial agreements that will happen will be of a very different nature. Whether it's in space, Starlink, the entry of Starlink, a lot of these issues that were earlier being looked at by the US only from a strategic geopolitical DC lens, I think will now start to, from the US side, be seen from a Silicon Valley commercial global market, including India market lens. And I think India must acknowledge that and then prepare for that accordingly. But I think it'll continue. But the nature might change a little bit because of that.
I think that's an interesting point, the shift in the center of gravity, in the sense, from Washington now to Silicon Valley and to other areas, as President Trump has made it very clear. The fact that he's not even in Washington, I mean, he doesn't consider that the main center of power, the power seat, as it were. How is that going to play out internationally? He said he wants to be seen as a peacemaker. How do you think this is going to play out internationally?
Well, I think as kind of as was brought up, I mean, like the question is who's going to be sort of his people that are going to be helping sort of make that peace. And so I think that he's privileged, sort of a number of different people, obviously, like sort of several billionaires in tech that have sort of lead worldwide important companies. He obviously thinks that AI is extremely important, so that's even sort of reinforced and cemented that idea in his head. And he's a non-traditional sort of Republican. He actually goes out and, like, to anybody who is a traditional Republican, he's kind of shunned them and actually thrown them out of his circle. So it's a really different group of people. And I do think he relies very heavily on this group of people to help sort of influence, like, what he thinks, what even constitutes peace. So I think even defining what does that mean and on what terms.
Do you see that Elon Musk has said that he's likely to come to India soon? How much do you think that is going to be a factor in the India-US relationship and what actually unfolds with Musk in India and Tesla and Starlink?
Yeah, no, so Elon Musk has, of course, had some amount of history with India. Earlier trips have been cancelled also. I think that his commercial interests are, of course, largely right now Tesla and Starlink. I think X maybe not so much to bear on the US-India relationship, but I think there he might try and extract certain concessions from the Indian government. And we've seen talk about the spectrum allocation for Starlink and other possible competitors from India. I think so we'll see some amount of concession happening to Elon Musk there. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that there are other executives that maybe are not so much in the news as Elon is, that are also going to drive tech and AI policy, let's say, and, for example, chips and other pieces that are important to India. And I think it's important for India to keep in mind that this is not purely a Elon Musk-driven show, but there are various others, as the inauguration very clearly shown, there are various other tech leaders who can shape, I think, US tech policy towards India. And I think it'll be very important for India to make sure that it does a good job of managing relationships with many of them, as opposed to being stuck on the one that's most in the news.
It's interesting that Prime Minister Modi is also one of the first international heads of state to meet President Trump in Washington. How significant do you think that is?
I think it's important. I mean, I think President Trump realizes, again, like the importance of India, the size of India, the scope of India. And I think he's admired Modi. In the sense of his success, sometimes some setbacks, but then sort of being able to sort of bounce back. And I think he also likes his vision.
One of the few heads of state to actually beat anti-incumbency in the elections around the world last year.
Exactly. And Trump likes what he considers if he thinks somebody's a winner. He loves the idea of winners. And so I think that Prime Minister Modi definitely falls in that camp of winners. But people have kind of gone back and forth between the winner and loser camp, and this even gets to the point of like what you had made about talking about tech sort of leaders, like Musk is a winner right now, but again, sometimes people fall out of favor with President Trump. And so I would suggest so sometimes maybe playing the long, some people that are playing the medium or long game may end up being the people that are actually sort of pivotal in this relationship especially on tech, between India and the US, and it may not be Musk. It may be, we'll see, we could list 3, 4, 5 people that it could be. There might be some favorites right now. And maybe not taking away from Trump's limelight is maybe a good strategy.
Yeah, that's true. Tell me, I mean, of course, also what seemed to play out, and this has played out in India as well, perhaps in elections, is the culture wars, which kind of has come into the political language, the political landscape. And in that sense, that America is now a different culture. America, it's been a win of this of woke versus anti-woke. It's a win of an America which is going back to its values, traditions, etc. How is that playing out right now?
Well, I mean, I think it played out a lot in the campaign. I mean, when you actually sort of think about sort of an issue that, like, you know, in the grand, it's not that it's not an issue that might be important, but like the transgender issue, like was like, I mean, thousands of commercials were played on this issue, and like, you know, when you ask voters like what's important to them, you know, it was the economy, it was immigration, you know, primarily those themes, maybe the state of democracy. And so, but you wouldn't think that, like, right, when you actually sort of looked at what was like sort of being highlighted sort of in the campaign, whether or not, you know, transgender individuals can compete in sports and things like that. I mean, this is like, there's a handful of people like where there's cases on this, but it's pretty small. And so the culture issues, and that's like what the attack is on American higher education. You know, when you think about what American higher education produces, it produces knowledge, and we live in a knowledge-based economy and society, and it's actually critical now. Have there been, you know, instances of where DEI and other sorts of things have maybe gone too far? Certainly, like, right, I would argue. But again, when you think about what American university is about, it's not really, I mean, it's about like treating everybody equally and with respect, but primarily it's about knowledge. It's about training students. It's about creating knowledge. It's about, like, you know, creating technology and sorts of things like that. And so, and we want, I think, everybody to be sort of a part of that. So, but like, again, getting to your question about this sort of, you know, wokeism, like, right? I mean, everybody would think that that's all we do in American university. And in fact, I would argue that we do a few other things.
Anirudh, how do you think it's playing out now? What's post-Trump America looking like for you as somebody who's really between both worlds?
I think the culture wars are very real. I think that the culture wars are not limited only to America. I think John and I were discussing this. I think the impact of these ideas that are right now getting traction in the US from a cultural, social standpoint will have implications on which groups in other parts of the world get emboldened versus not. Mm-hmm. And I think that the themes that are coming out of the new administration from a social standpoint, you'll find that whether it's in Europe, whether it's in other parts of Asia and India, you'll find that certain groups that align themselves with that kind of social thinking on social issues will get emboldened in other parts of the world. And I think as a big exporter of ideas, America has that privilege, but also a big responsibility to make sure that, you know, when the pendulum swings, as it swings in the US, right, from left to right, conservative to liberal, one sitting outside of the US hopes that the pendulum doesn't swing too much to the extremes. It's okay for it to swing, I think, a little bit from the left to the right and then back to the left, but one would hope that it doesn't swing way to the extreme on any of these social issues, because then I think, especially for a country like India and other parts of the world, I think the kind of social discord that sometimes gets sown, I think is not good for the economy. And, you know, that I think no one wants. Much like John's point about students, you don't want too much uncertainty, too much chaos, too much discord in society, because then that eventually impacts the economy and people's productivity.
And of course, with the DOGE now fully in action, the Department of Education, its next target, do you think Ivy League universities are also going to be on the radar now? Oh,
I think Ivy League universities have been on the radar for a little while. And so definitely, I mean, it's not just like, I mean, DOGE is obviously looking at like various components. I mean, there's already been policies that have changed at my university. I mean, they've stripped the word diversity off of almost all of their websites, and so they've come up with different ways to sort of think about that and more importantly talk about that. But you know, funding is an important issue. So research universities obviously raise money from alumni and from other foundations, but the government is a big funder, and obviously DOGE has created some havoc in university by some of their actions. Some of it is just talking about just cutting funds, but some of it is just freezing funds, you know, sort of immediately without warning, and that's very hard. I mean, like, I mean, universities are businesses. They're nonprofit businesses, but they're still businesses. They still have people, thousands of people. Penn's the largest. Comcast and Penn are the two largest employers in Philadelphia. And so when you look at that, you still have to make payroll. And like, you know, you still have to pay all these people that are doing all this medical research or this science research or this technology or engineering research, and in some instances, you know, research in the social sciences and humanities. But it's already making, I can tell you right now that the deans and presidents of my university are spending a lot of time thinking about this and also just wondering, because like uncertainty is bad for everybody. Like, right, we had said students, but it's bad for, I would argue, business. It's bad for university because you don't know exactly what the rules of the game are. And so we build, at university, we build our whole enterprise on the rules of the game. And if you don't know what those rules are, you're kind of left scratching your head. Right.
Well, it's going to be really interesting how India and the US rewrite the rules of the game in Trump 2.0 and actually Modi 3.0 as well. But thank you both, Professor Lipinski, Anirudh Suri, for being on the dialogues. It was great to hear your perspectives. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for having me.